President Trump recently said he's launched the fastest economic comeback in history. Let's examine that and the current state of the economy with Chris Liu, the former Deputy Secretary of Labor in the Obama administration. He also served as a former White House Cabinet Secretary for President Obama. He is in Arlington, Virginia. Thanks for joining us. Always good to see you, Chris.
Good to see you.
Okay, do you buy that as President Trump launched the fastest economic comeback in history?
Well, Larry, it's important to put this in context. During the two worst months of this pandemic, and we should qualify, we're still in it right now, the U.S. economy lost about 22 million jobs. We've certainly brought a lot of those jobs back, but we are not out of the woods at all. Just last week alone, over 2 million additional Americans applied for unemployment insurance. A total of 33 million people are on unemployment right now. Those are huge, huge numbers. And so, yes, the numbers have come back up, but there's every reason right now to think that this economy is stalling as we see states around the country beginning to pause or even roll back their reopenings. California this week just announced that they're going to start closing indoor restaurants and bars and gyms. And so we have ourselves in a very big hole right now, and it's going to take us a long time to come out of this.
A lot of people have cherished hopes of a so-called V-shaped economy bouncing back. What is that?
Well, what it means is that we got ourselves into a deep hole, and as the president thinks, we will be like a rocket ship and go straight up. The challenge is we are not going to have a V-shaped recovery, economic recovery, as long as we have a V-shape in COVID cases. And that's exactly what's happening right now. Whether you look at cases or deaths or hospitalization, things are clearly getting worse at this point right now as this virus spreads across the West and South. And the important thing to understand is that the U.S. economy relies on confidence. It's confidence among businesses and workers and customers. And no one is feeling particularly confident right now as we continue to struggle with this outbreak of this really horrible virus. And so until we get the public health crisis under control, we're really not going to have a sustainable economic recovery.
Well, is the president looking at this with rose-colored glasses?
Well, I think it's the usual way that he looks at the economy, which is he understands the importance of the economy to his reelection. He, prior to the pandemic, continued to praise himself for creating the greatest economy in history. That certainly was not the case. It was not the greatest economy ever, and certainly he had something to do with it, but he did not have everything to do with it. So he owns both the ups and he owns the downs of this economy. But you know what we're going to see when we get the second quarter GDP numbers, we're going to see a drop that we have not seen, ever. This will exceed what we saw likely during the Great Depression. And so this economy is really struggling right now.
As part of the CARES Act, out-of-work Americans have been getting an extra $600 a week on top of their regular jobless benefits. The program expires the end of this month. Nancy Pelosi said it should be extended. Should it?
I think it should. As I said, we have 33 million people in this country receiving some kind of unemployment benefit. These are people who have to make mortgages or pay rent or buy groceries, buy gas for their cars. And that $600 makes a big difference. Now, I know there's a big debate about whether it's too much or not, but let's also understand that the unemployment benefits in many states is egregiously low. In Arizona, it's $240 a week. Florida, it's $275 a week. Both of those are well below the minimum wage, the federal minimum wage. And so, look, there needs to be some additional enhancement because the truth is when unemployed people get that money, they're pumping it back into the economy. They're buying groceries, as I said, they're paying for the rent, and that's good for the economy, and it's good for those unemployed workers.
You optimistic or pessimistic?
I think in the short term, I am pessimistic because it frankly doesn't feel like we have this virus under control. And as I said, until we get it under control, the economy doesn't really recover. Long term, obviously, I'm optimistic. I mean, the U.S. economy is still the most resilient economy in the world, and we have gone through recessions and depressions and made it through. I worked for President Obama during the Great Recession, and until where we are right now, that was the greatest downturn we had had. And because of a lot of hard work and a lot of good policies, we got ourselves back out of that. But we should expect this economic downturn to last the rest of this year and much of next year, at the very least.
President Trump insists the country has no choice but to get kids back to school. Is that feasible?
Look, I think we all want kids to go back to school. We understand that they learn best when they are in a classroom with a teacher, but we also can't let politics take priority over public health. And right now, the Trump administration and the Department of Education have not laid out a plan for how that is going to happen, nor has Congress provided the funding to school districts to either purchase PPEs or to put up barriers between students or to separate them, create outdoor classrooms. All of that costs money. So yes, in the abstract, we all want kids to go back to school, but there needs to be a plan for that. And right now, there just doesn't seem to be one.
President Trump says the phase two deal with China is not underway or under consideration because relations are so damaged. Do you see any recovery, United States, and China?
Well, look, the president, has had this kind of schizophrenic relationship with China. Early in his administration, he thought his own personal goodwill with President Xi of China could get concessions from China. When that was not possible, we engaged in a trade war that hurt way too many farmers and manufacturers in this country. We cut a phase one deal that, essentially brought us back to before we got in the trade war and punted a lot of the really hard decisions until later. That's the phase two. So it's not surprising the president, in his effort to blame China for what's happening in the United States on this pandemic, is now taking phase two off the table. But the truth is, even before the pandemic, it wasn't clear that phase two was ever going to happen. The issues and the conflict between the United States on trade issues are far too intractable at this point.
China going to be a big election issue?
Look, the president wants to make it a big election issue. I'm not sure fundamentally it will be. I think Vice President Biden has a 45-year record of dealing with China. He understands the complexity of the relationship and that there are times where you partner with China and there are times when China is an adversary of yours. It's a complex relationship. I don't think this is a place that the president wants to go down in terms of his campaign strategy, because I'm not sure it necessarily helps him in any way.
To you, is Biden the clear favorite?
I think at this point in the race, you would have to say he is the clear favorite. Obviously, the president is a formidable opponent. He has a large war chest that he's willing to spend. As we have seen, he is willing to do literally anything to win election. But look, at this point, I think what is troubling for his reelection is the erosion of support that he has seen among a lot of key groups, both suburban women, among independents, even among his core base of white males without a college education. He started to see an erosion of support. And I think most troublingly for him is the erosion of support among senior citizens, who I think are really troubled by his handling of the COVID-19 crisis. And that's going to hurt him in places like Florida and Arizona.
What do you make of the record turnover in his cabinet at senior levels?
Well, look, I mean, this is something we saw from really day one of this administration. This is a president who proudly proclaimed that only I can solve these problems. And so he hasn't really valued people, not only among his White House staff, but in his cabinet, who are willing to say no to him, who are willing to disagree with him. And that's a problem. And we have seen the consequences of that during this pandemic. Stability, experience in government matter. And we take it for granted until we don't have that. And we have seen over the last 4 to 5 months really a failed government approach. Now, obviously, a lot of that is blamed on what's happening at the White House, but it's really kind of the lack of coordination, the lack of responsiveness within the federal agencies.
Chris, what do you make of the commutation of the sentence of Roger Stone?
Well, I think it's really troubling. I mean, let's not forget this is a convicted felon. who was convicted of obstruction of justice, witness tampering, lying to Congress. And what was he lying about? He was lying about the Trump campaign's a willingness and desire to seek information and assistance from the Russian government, from WikiLeaks. And he chose not to cooperate in the investigation, both by Mr. Mueller as well as Congress, in order to protect the president. So look, pardons are problematic, or certainly pardons by this president have been problematic. But when you commute the sentence of somebody who essentially covered up for you and took the fall for you, that's deeply troubling. Now, look, obviously the president has that power under the U.S. Constitution, but he's really engaging in very, very dangerous behavior that I think undermines the rule of law.
What's it going to take for Trump to turn this around, or is he up against it?
Look, I think at this point, in terms of the election, this election will be a referendum on Donald Trump. He's obviously counting on the economy picking up, and it probably will pick up a little bit. And I think it's one of the reasons why he's trying to force schools to reopen, because he understands if schools can fully reopen, then people can go back to work. But you can't will away a public health crisis. You can't will a economic recovery. You need to put hard work into this. And unfortunately, what we've seen from this president over the last 3.5 years is a premium on rhetoric and rosy scenarios instead of really doing the hard work of governing. I mean, when he was faced with not only the pandemic, but obviously the racial justice protests, if he had handled these like a responsible leader, he would be cruising towards re-election right now. And I think what the American people have seen is a failure of leadership in a moment of crisis. Look, anything can turn around. As I said, he's a formidable opponent, but he clearly is the underdog right now.
Chris, as always, thanks for your time today. Great seeing you.